The fluorescent lights in the waiting room had been flickering for 3 hours, and I had stopped noticing. I sat in the same plastic chair I'd sat in every day for 6 weeks, my purse on my lap, my coat still on, because when you're waiting for news about your grandson's spine, you don't think about being comfortable. Tyler was 17. He'd been a cross-country runner, the kind of boy who came home with muddy shoes and a grin that could rearrange of a riveted deeds. Then a distracted driver ran a red light in October, and now my grandson couldn't feel his left leg, and the surgeon who could fix it was in Boston, and the procedure cost $280,000. My daughter Karen was in the cafeteria, probably staring at cold coffee she wasn't drinking. She'd been doing that a lot lately. Her husband Derek had left 2 years ago, and she was raising Tyler and his little sister alone on a teacher's salary. The fundraiser we'd started had brought in $11,000 in 2 months. Neighbors, colleagues, strangers online. It was generous, and it was nowhere near enough. I was 63 years old. I'd spent 35 years as a pharmacist, raised Karen after my husband passed from a heart attack at 52, and I thought I understood what hard looked like. But sitting in that waiting room listening to Tyler try to laugh through his physical therapy sessions down the hall, I understood I hadn't known anything. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Dorothy Reeves. I believe we may be of use to each other. Please call at your convenience. James Harlan. I stared at it for a long time. Everyone in Kettlebrook, Maine knew the name James Harlan, the way you know the name of a landmark you've never actually visited. He'd bought the old Whitmore estate on the peninsula 7 years ago and promptly disappeared into it. The property sat behind a long gravel drive and iron gates, visible from the water if you took the ferry to the island. 3 stories of gray stone and Widow's Walk, a greenhouse that glowed at night, and a man no one could quite describe because almost no one had seen him up close. He sent representatives to town council meetings. He donated to the library restoration fund anonymously, except the check had his name on it, and the librarian told everyone he was rumored to be in his mid-60s, widowed, and extraordinarily wealthy from something in aerospace engineering. The other thing people said was that he always wore dark glasses, indoors, outdoors, morning, evening, dark wraparound glasses, even on overcast November days when the light off Penobscot Bay was thin as paper. I thought about it for it. That Hantamane. His voice was measured, unhurried. A voice that had spent decades in conference rooms and wasn't rattled by silences. He told me he'd heard about Tyler through the hospital foundation he quietly supported. He told me he had a proposition and that it would be better discussed in person. He told me he understood if I thought the situation was strange, but that he hoped I would come anyway. I went. The housekeeper who opened the door introduced herself as Patrice. She was a small woman in her 60s with a Haitian accent and eyes that missed nothing. She walked me through hallways lined with engineering blueprints framed like artwork, through a sitting room where every lamp had been fitted with the same warm amber bulb, and into a library at the back of the house where a fire had been going long enough to take the salt-damp chill out of the air. James Harlan was already standing. He was tall, lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they're thinking, with silver hair cut close and the kind of posture you develop when someone in your life insisted on it young. He wore a dark sweater, dark trousers, and those glasses. Indoors, with the curtains half drawn and a fire in the grate, he wore dark wraparound glasses, and he didn't explain them or apologize for them. He gestured to a chair. I sat. He remained standing, which I noticed. Corp. I need a wife. Not permanently. I need a wife for approximately 1 year. Someone who will live here, appear at certain necessary functions with me, and present to the outside world as my partner. In exchange, I will pay for your grandson's surgery in full and cover all rehabilitation costs through his recovery. I looked at him for a moment. Why? He turned slightly toward the fire. My son Garrett has filed a petition to have me He's arguing that my decision to withdraw from public life indicates mental deterioration. His lawyers have been photographing me, documenting my routine, interviewing people in town. If I can demonstrate that I'm living a normal, socially functional life, his petition fails. A wife, a credible, respected, real wife, is the most direct counter-argument. Why not just go out more? Prove it yourself. He was quiet for a moment. That's not something I'm able to do alone. You're a retired pharmacist with an excellent professional reputation. You're a widow, so there's no complication there. You've lived in this county for 30 years and people trust you. And, he paused, you're in a situation where the stakes are clear enough that you won't be distracted by sentimentality about what this is. What is it? A transaction. He said it without coldness, just precision. You get Tyler's surgery. I get what I need to protect the estate. At the end of the year, we divorce quietly, and you leave with an additional $40,000 and my permanent gratitude. I should have asked 100 questions. I should have said I needed time and driven home and called a lawyer. Instead, I thought about Tyler trying to describe what it felt like to not feel his leg, and I heard myself ask, what would be expected of me? Your own suite of rooms. No physical relationship. You would attend perhaps 3 or 4 events over the course of the year, host 1 or 2 small dinners here at the house. You'd need to be seen in town with me occasionally. Nothing theatrical, just a couple having coffee, going to the bookshop. You may visit your family as often as you like. I drove home along the Peninsula Road with the windows down despite the cold, trying to think clearly. I told Karen that night. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which meant she was frightened. Mom, she said finally, you don't know this man. No. But I know Tyler's prognosis without the surgery. She didn't say anything after that. Neither of us did for a while. We both knew the fundraiser had plateaued. We both knew her salary had a ceiling. We both knew that the window the surgeon in Boston had described was not going to stay open indefinitely. I called James Harlan's lawyer the next morning. The contract was 30 pages. I had Karen's friend who'd done 1 year of law school read through it, and she said it was one of the most thorough documents she'd ever seen, protecting both parties at every turn. Payment to the hospital upon signing, monthly allowance, exit terms. Confidentiality on both sides. I signed it on a Tuesday. We married at the county courthouse on a Friday, with Patrice and his lawyer as witnesses. I wore a gray wool dress I already owned. He wore a dark coat and those glasses, and when the clerk said the words, he nodded once, as if confirming a fact he'd already known. The estate was beautiful and bewildering. My suite was on the 2nd floor. 3 rooms overlooking the water, with a window seat I immediately claimed, and a clawfoot tub I did not deserve. Patrice showed me where things were, explained the rhythms of the house. Mr. Harlan worked in his study on the 3rd floor from early morning until mid-afternoon. He took breakfast at 7:30 and dinner at 6:30. He preferred quiet. He kept the house dimly lit. He was not unfriendly, but he did not require conversation. Does he always wear the glasses? I asked her. She adjusted a vase on the hallway table. Yes, ma'am. Inside, too. She looked at the vase rated out. He has his reasons. The first 2 weeks were like living in a very elegant library that happened to have another person in it. We ate meals mostly in silence, though he occasionally said something about the news or passed me a section of the paper. He briefed me on the upcoming events with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for a board presentation. Names, relationships, things not to mention, things to confirm. It felt like studying for an exam I hadn't signed for. Tyler's surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out. The Boston surgeon's office called to confirm the deposit had cleared, and I sat in the window seat and let myself cry quietly for about 4 minutes. Then I washed my face and went down to dinner. The first event was a fundraising dinner at the Kettlebrook Historical Society. James picked me up from my suite, impeccable in a dark suit, and offered his arm at the door in the way of a man who had rehearsed the gesture rather than invented it. The glasses were there. Slim, dark frames, indoors in an event hall with chandeliers blazing, and no one said a word about them because he was James Harlan and the Historical Society was very grateful for his donations. People wanted to talk to me. The news that he'd married was apparently the most interesting thing to happen to the peninsula in years. I smiled and said I'd been a pharmacist, that we'd met through a mutual friend, that I was very happy. James kept his hand at my back in a way that looked natural but felt like a stage direction. "You were convincing," he said in the car on the way home. I was honest. I told them the things that were true and left out the things that weren't. He turned slightly toward the window. "That's a useful skill." Tyler's surgery went 10 hours. Karen called me at 2 a.m. from Boston, crying too hard to speak clearly, and I understood from the shape of her crying that it had gone well. I was sitting in the library when she called, unable to sleep, surrounded by the particular Maine dark that comes in off the water and settles into a house like a guest. I didn't hear James come downstairs, but when I looked up, he was standing in the doorway in a wool robe, those glasses still on, holding 2 mugs. "Patrice told me about tonight," he said. "I thought you might want company that didn't require conversation." He sat in the chair across from me and we drank tea while the fire went low, and he didn't ask me how I was feeling, which was the most considerate thing anyone had done for me in months. The next few weeks, I started learning the house the way you learn a person. Patrice let me help in the kitchen sometimes. I found the greenhouse one morning and discovered that James grew orchids, dozens of them, in colors I'd have said were impossible if I hadn't been standing in front of them. He was there when I found it, deadheading stems with gloved hands, and he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite name. "These are extraordinary," I told him. He looked at them. "Growing things in winter makes the winter feel less absolute." The glasses, I'd begun to notice, were not a vanity or an eccentricity. In rooms where the light was very low, he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man negotiating terrain he couldn't entirely see. He angled and angled him He kept his hand on surfaces when he walked. I'd spent 35 years watching how people move through space, and I recognized what I was watching. I didn't say anything. Not yet. It was his son who said something first. Garrett arrived on a Tuesday without warning, past Patrice and into the front hall, before anyone could intervene. He was 40-something, sharp-faced, wearing the particular expression of a man who believed he was solving a problem. He stopped when he saw me arranging mail on the hall table. "So, you're the hired wife," he said. "Did he tell you what he did? Did he tell you why he lives up here behind gates pretending the world doesn't exist? You should wait for your father. He was at the controls of a private aircraft," he said, stepping forward. 12 years ago. Engine malfunction, emergency landing. Except the landing went wrong and a passenger was killed. A young woman, 26 years old. He walked away with his sight half destroyed and a settlement that could have rebuilt 3 towns. And he has spent every year since deciding he deserved to be locked away from everything. He's not locked away, he lives in his house. Garrett's smile was thin. He doesn't go anywhere without a handler now. Did you know that? Did he tell you he can't read standard print? That he designed the lighting in this house specifically around his visual field? He let my grandfather's estate go to ruin in his head while he hid here, and now I'm trying to protect what's left of it, and he's paying a stranger to stop me. I heard James's voice from the stairs. "Garrett." That's enough. He came down slowly, one hand on the rail, and stopped at the bottom with that stillness he had, that absolute quality of a man who had learned to make stillness do the work that motion couldn't. His son looked at him for a moment with an expression that had grief underneath the anger if you knew how to look. Then he left. That evening I knocked on James's study door. He said, "Come in." The room was lit from the side, 2 standing lamps positioned precisely, and he was sitting at a desk with his hands flat on its surface, not working, just sitting. I sat across from him. I told him I'd been a pharmacist for 35 years, and before that I'd cared for my mother through macular degeneration, and I knew partial vision loss when I saw it, and I was sorry I hadn't said anything sooner. He looked toward me, not quite at me, slightly to the left in the way I'd noticed before. How long have you known? A few weeks. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't my story to tell. I paused. It was a passenger. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Her name was Angela Voss. She was 26. She was flying back from her own father's funeral. The malfunction was not pilot error. The investigation confirmed that 3 separate times, but the aircraft went down and I walked out and she didn't, and no investigation was ever going to change that. Have you ever had treatment for the vision? The early surgeries helped some, stopped the progression. He pulled the glasses off for the first time and set them on the desk, and I looked at his eyes, which were pale gray and slightly unfocused, the left pupil irregularly shaped where something had damaged it. I can see well enough to function. I've adapted the house. He stopped. I don't do well in unpredictable light, public spaces. I can't read faces clearly anymore, and I can't always tell where a step ends, and it became easier to stop going than to keep managing the gap between what people expected and what I could do. There are specialists, I said carefully. Low vision rehabilitation. It doesn't restore what's lost, but it expands what you can do safely. I know someone at the main eye center who's worked with pilots. He looked at his glasses on the desk. I'm not sure I deserve to expand what I can with. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, I said, and I meant it gently. You walked out of a wreck you didn't cause, and you've been serving a sentence for 12 years for not dying. Angela Voss's death was a tragedy. It was not a punishment assigned to you. He put his glasses back on slowly. I'm not sure I know how to live as if it isn't. You could try learning. He didn't say anything. I called the specialist the next morning. James started loading the following week. I drove him to Portland for the first 3 appointments because Patrice's English was better than her driving, which was what she herself said. He sat in the passenger seat on the way there and talked more than I'd heard him talk in months. About Angela's family, who had eventually stopped returning his letters. About the estate his father had built, an aerospace manufacturing business that Garrett now wanted to liquidate. About orchids, and why the specific wavelength of the light in the greenhouse produced better root development. He was, I discovered, extraordinarily interesting once he decided you were worth talking to. The rehabilitation changed things slowly and then all at once. He got glasses calibrated to his specific visual field. He learned mobility strategies he'd been too proud or too punishing to seek before. He started going into town with me for coffee on Saturday mornings, sitting across from me at the table at the bakery on Harbor Street while people absolutely stared and tried to look like they weren't staring. He asked me one Saturday, over coffee that neither of us was drinking, about my husband. He was an electrician. Funny. The kind of funny where you couldn't always tell if he was joking until 3 seconds later. He died at 52, and I have spent 11 years being furious at him for it. James wrapped his hands around his mug. I was married for 19 years. She had cancer. I had all the medical contacts in the world, and none of them made any difference. I'm sorry. She would have been irritated by the orchids, he said. She was a practical person. I laughed before I meant to. He turned toward the sound with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. Garrett filed his next motion in month 8. His lawyers had assembled a portrait of James as a reclusive eccentric who had abandoned professional society, failed to manage the estate's holdings responsibly, and they'd found an old letter where James had described his guilt over Angela Voss in terms that, taken out of context, sounded like instability. They also argued directly that our marriage was a transaction engineered to obstruct the competency petition. The hearing was on a Thursday. James had barely slept. I knew because I could hear him in the study above my room at 2 a.m, the careful, measured pacing of a man too controlled to show distress any other way. The night before, we sat in the library. He was holding a book he wasn't reading. I was holding a book he wasn't reading. I was holding tea. I wasn't drinking. If Garrett wins, he said. He won't. You don't know that. I know you. I set my cup down. You've spent 12 years punishing yourself for surviving. You built a life in here that costs you nothing because you decided you didn't deserve to spend anything. And then Tyler needed surgery and I showed up, and somehow in the last 8 months, you've started going to Portland and talking to the bakery owner by name, and the orchids in the greenhouse have never looked better. I looked at him. That's not a man who can't manage his own estate. That's a man who needed a reason. He looked in my direction for a moment. That careful left-of-center gaze I'd learned to understand. What happens at the end of the year? I hadn't let myself think about it directly. The contract was in month 8. In 4 months, according to the terms, we'd file quietly and I'd go home. I don't know, I said, which was not entirely honest. The hearing was in a room that smelled like old carpet and photocopier copper. Garrett's lawyer was polished and prepared, Bob Perplexed. She presented the letters, the documentation of James's limited public presence, testimony from a financial advisor who suggested the estate's holdings had been underperforming relative to the industry. She was careful not to mention Tyler directly, but the implication hung in the room. This marriage was manufactured to solve a specific problem and nothing more. Patrice testified. She said James had changed in the last year in ways that were not her professional business to catalog, but that were unmistakable. She said he got in a car and went to Portland. She said he ate breakfast with his wife. She said the house felt different. The judge asked her what she meant by different, and Patrice thought about it and said, inhabited. The specialist from the main eye center testified about James's rehabilitation, his commitment to the program, his concrete improvements in navigating unpredictable environments. He said these were not the choices of a man indifferent to his own capacity. Then I was called. Garrett's lawyer looked at me the way people look at things they intend to disassemble. Mrs. Harlan, you entered into a financial arrangement with the defendant prior to this marriage. Is that correct? James and I had discussed the terms of what I could say. Yes, we had an agreement. And the agreement included payment for your grandson's medical care. It did. So your marriage to James Harlan was, essentially, a business transaction. I looked at James. He was sitting very still at the table, those calibrated glasses on, hands folded, waiting for the verdict the way he'd learned to wait for things. I thought about the first night in the library, drinking tea while he didn't ask me how I was feeling. I thought about the orchids, and him saying that growing things in winter makes winter feel less absolute. I thought about the Saturday mornings at the bakery and the way he turned toward laughter, like a plant turning toward light. It began as an arrangement, I said. That's true. But what you're asking me to call a transaction is 12 years of guilt coming off a man piece by piece, and physical therapy that he drove to willingly, and a Saturday morning at a bakery where he ordered coffee by name for the first time in a decade. So if the question is whether this marriage is real, the answer is yes. Whether it began that way is a different question, and it has nothing to do with whether James Harlan can manage his own estate. The judge asked me directly, "Do you love your husband?" The room was very quiet. "Yes," I said. "I do." The judge ruled in James's favor. Garrett's petition was dismissed. His lawyer was already preparing the appeal language, but James's lawyer said quietly that there were no grounds, that this was finished. Outside the courthouse, Garrett stood by his car. He looked older out here in the November light than he had inside. He looked at his father for a long moment, and I saw, again, the grief beneath the strategy. "I'm not trying to hurt you," Garrett said. "I know," James said. "I know that." They didn't embrace, but Garrett nodded, something complicated moving across his face, and then he got in his car and drove away. That night was quiet in the way that comes after long tension releases. Patrice had made soup and left it on the stove. We sat in the kitchen instead of the dining room, which was something we'd started doing over the last couple of months without discussing it. James had his glasses off, which he did now sometimes in low, even light. "In 3 months," he said, "the contract expires." I stirred my soup. I want to tell you something, he said carefully. And I want you to understand that you're not obligated to respond to it in any particular way. He looked at his hands. This year has been the first year in a long time that I have felt like a person rather than a consequence. And I know that was supposed to be a transaction. And I know you came here for Tyler. And I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. But I would rather tell you and be wrong about it than not tell you. Tell me what? That I love you, he said. That I would like you to stay. Not because of a contract. Just stay. I thought about my house on the other side of town, the small place I'd lived alone in for 11 years. I thought about Tyler, 3 months out from surgery, who had walked 40 yards in physical therapy last week and sent me a voice message that was mostly just him laughing. I thought about Karen, who had met someone recently, a quiet man who taught history at the high school and blushed when she spoke to him. And I thought about James, who had stopped wincing at certain kinds of light, who had learned 3 baristas' names, who had told me the previous Saturday that the orchids were about to bloom. You'd have my family here, I said. Tyler and Karen. You understand that. He was very still. I'd consider it an honor. I want Tyler to be able to come and go like it's his home. Not a guest. James, I said, I know where you're going with that, but I want to hear you say it. He looked toward me. I don't want you to leave your family, Dorothy. I want to become part of it. I reached across the table. He took my hand with both of his, carefully, the way he held things when he meant to keep them. We didn't formally renew vows. That wasn't who we were. We filed the paperwork to nullify the divorce terms, and Patrice made a dinner that she described as celebratory and that involved 3 courses and a bottle of wine James had been keeping for an occasion that had never previously arrived. Tyler came to stay for the first 2 weeks of summer. He walked the Peninsula Road every morning for his physical therapy and came back pink-cheeked and hungry. He and James had long conversations in the library about engineering and physics that I wasn't entirely qualified to follow, and I sat in the window seat and read and listened to them talk. And the house sounded like what Patrice had called it. Inhabited. Karen brought the history teacher at Christmas. His name was Paul, and he was so nervous at dinner that he knocked over his water glass, and James refilled it without comment and steered the conversation somewhere Paul could breathe, which is something I would not have predicted from the man I'd first met in that library, with his hands behind his back and his voice flat as a transaction. He volunteers at the Lighthouse Museum on Saturdays now. They digitized their archive, and he helps visitors navigate it, which suits his visual field better than most things. He knows everyone who comes in. He knows the ferry schedule and the bakery owner's daughter's name and which Tuesday the library holds its reading group. He's not the same man he was. Neither am I. I married a reclusive stranger to save my grandson's life. I thought I understood exactly what I was doing and what it was worth, and how it would end. I thought I was making a practical decision. Clean lines, no confusion. I had been a pharmacist for 35 years, and I believed in reading a label carefully before you committed to anything. But love doesn't come labeled. It comes in amber-lit rooms and Saturday mornings, and someone who knows not to ask how you're feeling at 2 in the morning and just makes tea. It comes in watching a man decide, slowly and with help, that surviving wasn't the crime he thought it was. Tyler is 18 now and planning to study engineering. Karen is getting married in June in the greenhouse because she asked James where the best light was, and he said, here, in the morning when they open. He was right. He usually is, about light. And me, I'm where I'm supposed to be, in the house on the peninsula, in the winter that feels less absolute, because things are growing in it. I came here for a contract. I stayed for a life. Some days I still catch myself amazed that those turned out to be the same thing.